Welcome to Theolotics, the intersection of truth and opinion. We're here talking today with Neal Hardin about an article he wrote. It's up on our website at theolotics.com. It's about the U.S. Supreme Court decision that was somewhat astonishing, Bostock versus Clayton County. Our organization, Advocates for Faith and Freedom, filed an amicus brief in this case. Let me read the question presented that the court was to decide: whether discrimination against an employee because of sexual orientation constitutes prohibited employment discrimination because of sex within the meaning of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that is what the court had to decide. Really, the question is, ultimately, in layman's terms, what does the word sex, S-E-X, mean in the 1964 Civil Rights Act? So when looking back in 1964, really, the court should have been taking a look to decide what did the word sex mean in 1964. Neil, you had a chance to read the case a little bit more. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the facts as you know them?
Yeah, so the funny thing is that even in the majority opinion, everyone acknowledges that the word sex in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 meant what we would commonly think it means, which is biological sex. Mm-hmm. But through their reasoning, they said, well, sexual orientation and gender identity are closely tied to the concept of sex, and so therefore it's covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is really quite astounding as far as you could probably speak more to the judicial aspects of how why that's so concerning, because they said, well, there's been prior court cases where we've used the Civil Rights Act in 1964 to, go beyond the literalistic definition of how people might have understood. And so they're kind of, because the word sex is meant to include things like maybe motherhood or like a man who was sexually harassed, even though it was probably originally given to protect women. Mm-hmm. So they say, well, we've expanded it this far, so basically what's the harm in expanding it further to include sexual orientation and gender identity?
So significant harm in this case is if we even just ignore the issues of sexuality and we just think about what the Supreme Court did here. Justice Gorsuch, who was an individual who most of us thought when he was appointed would be one who would stick to the truest sense of words and with what we call a strict interpretation of not only the Constitution, but with regard to statutes as well. We call it statutory interpretation when we're litigating these kinds of cases, and there's a question over what a statute means. And the very first, most basic thing you learn in law school is when you look at a statute, you look at its plain meaning. And in order to interpret that statute, that's what the courts are supposed to do. Look at the plain meaning. If it's vague, then they can look beyond that. But if it's not vague and unclear, then they just look at the meaning. And so when looking at the word sex as a category, it always has meant biological sex. It's a basic. This case turned out to be 70-some pages long in writing that, frankly, really could have been, let's open the dictionary and see what the word sex says. And the sex means biological sex. So what is really concerning about this case is that now Justice Gorsuch and Justice Roberts joined with the liberals to legislate from the bench, meaning that they created law. Congress has had for many years, there have been attempts to amend the Civil Rights Act to allow for the expansion to include sexual orientation, gender identity, etc.
Equality Act.
The Equality Act, exactly. So there's been an attempt to expand it year after year after year after year, and they haven't had the votes to include that. And set aside whether that's right or wrong, or whether there should be whether discrimination is proper or improper as it relates to sexual orientation issues. Just focusing on the question of whether or not the judges should or should not legislate from the bench is what the biggest issue and my biggest concern about this. And you pointed out in the article that is up and that you've written, and you talked about the basis for why do we have separation of powers? Address that.
Yeah, it was like the founders understood that mankind is inherently sinful. They are operating from a Judeo-Christian perspective in that regard, and they know that when observing governments of the past, when you accumulate all this power in one person or one legislative body, it can grow very corrupt because the old adage goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so what they did was they divided our government into three separate branches, the legislative, the executive, and then the judicial branch. Mm-hmm. And by dividing up the power in that way and kind of setting them at odds against each other with checks and balances, they were able to divide that power so as to, one, reduce corruption and basically as a preventative measure against tyranny on the people. And so when you look at the judiciary branch, their job is to interpret the law. When there's a question of is this constitutional or not, or what does this law mean, the legislative makes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. And separation of powers would say, maybe I should say, the judiciary branch should not take on the role of the legislature by making law. And that's basically what they did in this case, is because Congress has understood, and Kavanaugh in his dissent just goes example after example, Congress has understood this, the executive branch has understood this, the states have understood that sexual orientation and gender identity is not included in the word sex. And so they've had to pass, or they would need to pass additional legislation. Which
is why year after year after year, there's been the push by many to get the Equality Act passed, and they just didn't have the votes. Mm-hmm. Up to when I was in Washington, it was sometime last year, that was a big issue at that point in time, was, attempting to get the Equality Act passed, and, there just wasn't enough votes. And so here what happens is we're seeing the liberal side of the court, along with Justice Gorsuch and Justice Roberts, who I'm beginning to wonder where they stand, instead of interpreting, legislating from the bench to accomplish what they couldn't legislatively. So you mentioned that we have these three branches of power. Biblically in Scripture, where do you see that this was somewhat of a biblical mandate of the separation of powers?
I think just from an understanding of human nature, primarily, that when, just understanding that man is by nature sinful, that they are prone to abuse power if given it, and that they wanted to divide that power up so that way it was just less likely that a government would abuse the people. You also have that they got the idea of the three branches from a scripture, I believe it's in Isaiah, which says that God is our lawgiver, our king, and our judge. But we also see...
And that's the basis of these three separation, the separation of powers between these three branches. Okay. So you find as a, as a theologian, really, that's what you are, master's in theology, so I'm leaning on you. I'm just a lawyer, so I can do interpretation and argue, but you can give me the interpretation of Scripture, right? So that was your understanding, though, that in history, our founding fathers looked to Scripture to establish the separation of powers.
Absolutely.
And that's been super important. I look back on the days back in 2003 or 4, I was litigating the same-sex marriage case when we were trying to put a stop to the mayor, Gavin Newsom, at the time. Now he's the governor of California, and I was in Sacramento or in San Francisco arguing to put a stop to the same-sex weddings. And my argument was, look, the people of California voted for Proposition 22 at the time that said marriage can only be between a man and a woman. Now, this single mayor decided that he was going to ignore the law and he was going to issue marriage licenses. And at that time, I said, look, if if one individual or the courts have the ability to override the vote of the majority of the people of California who said marriage can only be between one man and one woman, then what's the value of the vote? It's really this concept of the separation of powers, because California gives the people, through a direct initiative, they have the ability to actually create legislation as the legislature. So back then I said, look, whether you agree with same-sex marriage or not, do you agree with the importance of voting? Do you agree with the importance of preserving the value of the vote? And in a similar way, that's what we have here in this Bostock case, where legislating from the bench means we voted for legislators to create law. And if the legislators, who are the ones who are supposed to create law, are overridden by a single individual, what power is the vote?
Yeah, it completely undermines the democratic process of electing legislators, of voting for presidents. Like, those two branches are, like, the legislative branch is meant to create laws. Again, executive enforces them. The judiciary is not supposed to do either of those things.
Let's talk about the issue of sex here. I think that, based upon your article as you've written it, and I agree, invidious discrimination, that's a term that's used that basically says discrimination without rationale is invidious. It's abhorrent. There's no basis that someone should be discriminating against an individual, even based upon their sexual orientation, because just because, right? As Christians, we should be above that. What do you say about the scripture with regard to discrimination against persons on the basis of sexual orientation to start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would point to one scripture, Colossians 4:1, says, "Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven." And throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, God is concerned with hired workers and people who work for others, because they know that God knows that they can be taken advantage of, and he put all sorts of laws in place to protect them. Mm-hmm. So discriminating for no good reason against someone just because of, and especially in a pluralistic society that we live in, just because of who they sleep with at night, when they need a job, they need to be able to provide for themselves. Like, that's not furthering any good outcome. It just is simply fire them just for that.
I've often been asked by persons saying, well, I have this individual that works for me, and the question is, what should we do? I've had private Christian schools who have said, we have this child that has two mommies, and we're trying to decide what to do. And I often look at that and say, well, look, one, we're called to love. Mm-hmm. We're called to love one another. And we are called to the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so I've often looked at that and said, look, here's an opportunity for you to minister, right? Here's an opportunity as as you said, masters and bondservants, masters, employer, employees kind of scenarios. Love on them, help them, lead them into knowledge of who Christ is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a business is an opportunity to do that. If you're a business owner and you have an employee who's identified as LGBTQ or whatever, like, that's an opportunity for them to observe you as a boss and to see how you live your life, how you treat them, how you are able to show the love of Christ in that situation.
Okay, but in this case, there was something unique about this. So there were three cases that came together, and one of them involved the Harris Funeral Home. Now, we filed, Advocates for Faith and Freedom, we filed an amicus brief in that case in support of the employer. And in that instance, there was the director of the funeral home decided that they were going to be transgendered, and had, as I understand it, had been seeing a counselor and was diagnosed with gender dysphoria and made a decision and was encouraged to convert to dress like a woman and become transgendered. Now, scripturally, you are what you are, right? I mean, God created us. You've quoted here in Scripture that in Genesis 1:27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him male and female. I mean, that's just pretty simple and straight. You also quoted Deuteronomy 22:5, a woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. And so, this concept of changing your identity, I think really it goes against Scripture, right?
Yeah, well, what it boils down to is God is the creator, we are created, and God created us male and female, and that's clear throughout Scripture, and there's never any question of whether our gender or our sex is tied to our mental state. It's always tied to our biology. It's always tied to the way he made us as human beings. The concept of gender identity and sexual orientation, for that matter, would have been completely foreign to the Bible.
The issue of what happened in the Harris Funeral Home case. So the director of the funeral home decided to transgender and to identify as the opposite sex. And, I'll be frank. I think that, you've seen circumstances like that. And just imagine, lady's been married to her husband for 70 years and she comes to the funeral home and that's where, they bought their, bought insurance or whatever. And they, had arrangements already made. And, in the fall, they were meeting with the director of the funeral home, who was a man, and then they come back in the spring after the husband's passed away, and now you have the same person who's dressed in a dress and wearing makeup. That's a bit different than someone who identifies as gay or lesbian, right? I mean, to me, it seems significantly different, doesn't it?
I mean, it's probably more shocking to the customer than because you notice a physical outward difference.
Yeah, I guess my point is that when addressing that kind of an issue, there has to be more common sense applicable as to whether or not it is permissible or impermissible. My understanding is that the Harris Funeral Home operated based upon a Christian belief system, that they were Christians and this was a ministry. Now, under those circumstances, it becomes much more difficult because now we're talking about people who have faith-based convictions, employers with faith-based convictions. And what this act does is it actually creates a question to some degree. How is this redefinition of the word sex going to affect businesses, employers? How's it going to affect religious nonprofit organizations, right? Well, what do you think about from a biblical perspective, whether or not the Harris Funeral Home should or should not have had the right to be able to terminate the employment of that funeral director who decided to transgender?
Yeah, part of me thinks it would depend on the employment contract that was signed with the employee and whether they knew that they were operating as a Christian business and that they were agreeing to operate within the bounds that the owner had set up. And if now he wants to identify as transgender and is willingly, knowingly going against what he originally agreed to, then I would say, yeah, you've violated your employment contract.
Okay, but let's assume that's not the case. Let's assume that there is no employment contract and the individual just decides they want to transgender. And let's assume that the funeral home is not, it's not a church. And it is simply a business that now you have someone who wants to change. And I mean, my concern is that the people, their customers it could be very difficult for customers to be able to wrap their heads around. They're already struggling with the death of a family member possibly, and here they're coming, and now they have to deal with this significant cultural shift, this change. To me, that, the transgender issue is significantly different. But what do you think? From a biblical perspective, forget whether there's a contract or not. It's just, how should the employer address that circumstance?
I mean, honestly, it's a bit of a gray area. I mean, I would first recommend that they pray about it, that they seek the Lord's counsel, that they seek legal and spiritual counsel. Whether they retain that employee or not is, I think, up to the employer in that case.
Yeah, I guess, it is a tough one because, I think the scripture is clear in saying what our moral principles are and are not. And I think, just relying upon scripture, the truth that we shouldn't discriminate in an invidious manner, as I said earlier, just, without basis or without reason. But again, what is Theolotics? We are about the intersection of truth and opinion, trying to bring theology into all topics, into all issues, political, cultural issues of current concern. And that is this case. I mean, this presents one of the most significant issues that we're faced with today, and that is dealing with the issues of sexuality. And so I think we all agree that regardless of whether one agrees or thinks, supports transgender, supports the LGBTQ issues, regardless, I think people can agree that this was not a good decision and that the court's legislating from the bench. But from a perspective of, what's right and wrong, I guess there is some question, I guess, you have in your mind as to, this setting, whether or not this transgendered individual should have been allowed legally to have been terminated.
Yeah, because on one hand, you want to be able, just because they now identify as transgender, that doesn't negate the command to love them. That doesn't negate the command to, uphold agreements that we've made with them. We want to be able to keep our word. But on the other hand, we have to balance that with religious liberty concerns. And okay, how do I want to operate my business? Is this employee going to be able to function in a way which is compatible with how I've set up my business as a Christian-based funeral home? So there's just multiple competing factors that you have to be able to weigh. Yeah,
the disruption potentially to the employment environment as well. I mean, how's it going to have an impact on other employees? And so, yeah, that's a tough question. It's an interesting one. As I said, we filed a brief in support of the employer because, I felt that the employer had the legal right, or should have had the legal right, to be able to discriminate in that fashion for that job position. However, the court disagreed, and we'll see what happens here in the future. I think one of the things as well is that what's shocking is that 20, 30 years ago, this would not even have been a question, right? I mean, this question of what sex means. Why is it that somehow now sex no longer means biological sex? It is used to describe people, and we've always understood that to be male and female. That is science. It is just straight out of science, right? Biology. But somehow we've turned from that in the last number of years, and I would say probably the last 10 to 15 years. This has really become a different issue. It's now gender identity. And really what Theolotics is all about, one of the things that when I started to think about why we wanted to launch this ministry in the first place, is because when I look back in history, I look at evolution and the litigation over evolution in the courts, and our side lost, the conservative side lost, to the point that you were not even permitted to teach creationism or even intellectual design in many instances here. You couldn't teach it. You could only teach evolution. So what does that do? That undermines the principles of the Bible. So they also prevented the Bible from being taught in school. So you eliminate the Bible in the 60s, 50s, 60s, I guess it was, and then evolution in that era as well. I think it was the 60s, even up into the 70s. In eliminating intelligent design. And then we get into the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and now we're talking about questions of sex. We're talking about sexual orientation issues. We're talking about, today, what sex means. And I believe that this concerted effort, particularly in the public schools, undermining the truth of the Scripture by coming out and saying, well, you can be whatever you want to be. Now ignoring science. Before it used to be, well, let's focus on science. Science establishes evolution, right? And there's lots of arguments against that. But regardless, we rely on science. And now, oh no, we don't rely on science any longer. Now we rely on psychology and your ability to be able to claim to be whatever you want to be. And I think what's happened is that whole propaganda has caused us to, many people in society, to ignore the truth and ignore Scripture and say, boy, the Scripture must not be true. Yet it is. I mean, as I've said before, we can prove the truth of Scripture. I believe we can take the federal rules of evidence and apply it and prove that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, that God exists. There's so much to it. But undermining, it's a satanic ploy to undermine the truth of Scripture. I think that's where we're at today. We have this definition of sex at the U.S. Supreme Court, ignoring the most basic definition. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, biblically speaking, like I mentioned before, sex is directly tied to our created being, who we are in our body, and it's closely tied to reproduction as well. It's like we were created male and female in part so that we could be fruitful and multiply. Mm-hmm. So for the Supreme Court to say that sex is now defined by, what you think you are in your mind, or to say that sex is now also includes who you're sexually attracted to, as like you're a certain category of person based on who you're attracted to, that it's become this identity. And the same thing with gender identities, like you're now a different type of person. It's just completely contrary to the worldview that Scripture presents. Yeah,
I would encourage our supporters and people who are watching this to really go back to Scripture and focus on the truth, because there's a lot of deception in the world. There's a lot of there's so much deceit when it comes to the issue of sexuality, on particularly this question, even to the point where we're seeing kids that are, in elementary school they're talking about, reassignment surgery and hormone treatment for allowing them to, try to change their quote unquote sex. It's significant. It's dangerous. So, well, thanks for being with me. Please go read the article at theolotics.com on the Bostock versus Clayton County. It's the case dealing with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as it relates to transgender and sexual identity issues. So God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you.